I knew something was off the second I saw tire tracks on my mountain land. I'm Solomon Kray, retired structural engineer and proud owner of 20 acres of high ridge land just outside of Willow Creek, Colorado. Bought it 15 years ago with the money I saved busting my back on job sites and drawing blueprints for buildings that still stand taller than egos in this town. I kept that land untouched. No structures, no utilities, just forest, rocks, and views that made you forget your blood pressure. So when I hiked up there one morning and saw a full-blown 2-story house, vinyl siding, stone veneer, wrap-around porch, I thought I was hallucinating. But no, there it was, a house, on my land. I stormed down to the development at the base of the ridge, a gated community called Silver Pines. I never bought into it, literally or figuratively. Their HOA had tried to rope me in years ago, claiming my property was adjacent enough to qualify. I laughed them all the way back to their manicured mailboxes. At the front office, I was met with that familiar shrill voice of Linda Sharp, head of the HOA and self-proclaimed queen of the valley. Mid-50s, always in lavender with a haircut that looked like it lost a bet. "Solomon," she said, her voice already 2 octaves too high. "Oh, I was going to call you, Linda. There's a house on my mountain. Care to explain?" She gave this weird little laugh like she was auditioning for a villain role in a soap opera. "Oh, that. We had a new member sign up for a premium view lot. There was a little confusion with the county lines, but we took care of it." "You what?" "We poured the foundation last month. The lot was listed as vacant for years." "Because it's mine, Linda." She blinked, pretending to be confused, which only infuriated me more. "Well, that's not what our surveyor said. Your surveyor's a hack. I have the original deed coordinates and updated GIS maps. That's my land." Her lips pursed like she sucked a lemon. "Well, I'm sure we can come to some mutual understanding. You're gonna want to sit down for the next part of this conversation," I said, backing away. I wasn't playing around. I went straight to the county recorder's office. Took less than 10 minutes to pull up my deed, topo overlays, and zoning lines. The house was 160 yards into my property, not even close to a border error. I filed a cease and desist that afternoon. The HOA ignored it. Next week, they had contractors out landscaping the place like it was a vacation rental. Linda even held an open house. That's when I knew they thought I was bluffing. So I called an old friend from my demo days. Jed owns a grading business and still owes me a favor from back when I saved his permit from getting torpedoed. "Jed," I said, "you still got that Cat 963 with the Ripper blade?" "Sure do." "You got a permit?" "I'll have it by morning." I pulled permits for demolition based on unauthorized construction on private land. County clerk knew me and didn't even blink. Long overdue. Someone put that HOA in check. The next morning, just as the sun cracked over the ridge, I met Jed at the trailhead. The bulldozer roared up the slope like it had unfinished business. Linda showed up halfway through the demolition, screeching like a banshee and waving what looked like a printed email. "You can't do this. That's HOA property." "No, Linda," I shouted over the engine. "It's my property and you're trespassing." She tried to block the dozer. Jed honked once and she scrambled back, losing a heel in the mud. By noon, that house was a pile of rubble. I left the debris exactly where it landed, a monument to arrogance. Linda called the sheriff. The sheriff called me. After I showed him the permits and deed, he just nodded and said, "Well, looks like she's got some explaining to do." A week after the demolition, I was sitting on my porch with a mug of black coffee when a process server strolled up my driveway like he was delivering a pizza. He handed me a thick envelope stamped with the seal of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association and a court notice from the 20th Judicial District. They were suing me for destruction of community property and emotional distress. I didn't laugh. I didn't curse. I just read through the documents while the server awkwardly waited for a signature. Their argument was flimsy, full of vague language about easement assumptions and temporary ownership transfers. but it was the inclusion of a forged quitclaim deed that changed everything. They'd filed a document claiming I relinquished a portion of my land to the HOA 2 years ago. The signature was a crude imitation of mine, loopier, like someone had glanced at it once and guessed the rest. And the witness signature? Linda Sharp's. Naturally, I made 2 phone calls. First, to my niece Carla, a property attorney out of Denver who'd built her reputation dismantling shady development deals. Second, to my buddy Ruben, a retired deputy from Gunnison County who now taught criminal justice at the community college and had a pensioner's fondness for exposing fraud. By the following Tuesday, Carla had subpoenaed the HOA's internal communications, project approvals, and all documents related to the construction. She filed a motion to dismiss their lawsuit and counterclaimed for land fraud, trespassing, and malicious prosecution. Ruben, meanwhile, took a good hard look at the forged deed and made a few quiet calls to a handwriting expert he trusted. Carla and I met with the judge for a preliminary hearing in a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled like old varnish and cold coffee. Linda sat 3 rows back with her lawyer, a man who looked like he'd lost a bet and ended up representing her. She had on a navy blazer with gold buttons, trying to look official, but her foot tapped like someone who knew the ice was cracking. When the judge asked for initial statements, Carla stood. "Your Honor, my client never signed away his land. The document in question is fraudulent and we can prove it. We have an expert prepared to testify on handwriting analysis, and we've already submitted a chain of emails showing that the HOA board fast tracked the construction without verifying ownership. We also have county GIS records showing the house was never permitted for that parcel." Linda's lawyer stood, cleared his throat, and launched into a speech about community growth and shared vision. The judge cut him off halfway through a metaphor about rising property values being like rising tides. "Spare me the nautical poetry," the judge said. "This isn't a TED talk. Show me the legal basis for your claim." They had none. The judge scheduled a full hearing. In the meantime, Carla filed a motion to freeze the HOA's discretionary spending accounts, citing ongoing fraudulent activity. That got approved faster than I expected and caused a full-blown panic in Silver Pines. Within days, HOA board members started jumping ship. First was Mark Delaney, the treasurer, who resigned with a 4-sentence email and no forwarding address. Then came Janine Torres, the vice chair, who told a reporter from the local paper that she'd been misled by leadership and that she never saw the original land documents. Meanwhile, Ruben dug deeper. He found that the surveyor the HOA contracted an out-of-town outfit called Ridge Point Mapping wasn't actually licensed to operate in Colorado. Their business registration had expired 3 years earlier, and their mailing address belonged to a shuttered bait shop in Idaho. Carla submitted all of this in a supplemental brief. The judge responded by ordering a forensic audit of the HOA's finances. Linda cracked 3 days later. She walked into the county sheriff's office with a manila folder and a face that looked like it hadn't slept in a week. She confessed that the board knew the land wasn't theirs but had gone forward with construction anyway, assuming I'd either sell or settle quietly. She claimed they forged the deed to keep the project on schedule and blamed the idea on Delaney, who by that point had already left the state. The sheriff took her statement and turned it over to the district attorney. Charges were filed for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit land theft. When the full hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. News had spread, and people were hungry to see the HOA finally get put in its place. Carla laid out our case with surgical precision. She produced the original deed, GIS overlays, and the testimony of the handwriting expert. She showed bank records indicating that HOA funds had paid the unlicensed surveyor and construction crew without any formal bidding process. Then she dropped the bomb, a board meeting recording anonymously submitted in which Linda could be heard saying, "We'll build first and deal with Solomon later. He's old. He'll cave." The judge's gavel hit the bench hard enough to echo. His verdict was blistering. The HOA was ordered to pay for full remediation of the site, punitive damages for trespassing, and legal fees in full. The forged deed was entered into evidence for the criminal trial, and the judge recommended a full review of Silver Pines' charter by the state attorney general. Linda was handcuffed in the hallway. I walked out of that courthouse with Carla beside me and Ruben waiting by the truck, arms crossed, eyes scanning the parking lot like he was still on patrol. A few residents from Silver Pines were standing by the steps, watching. One of them, a former Marine named Hutchins I used to see at the local diner, nodded at me. "About time someone stood up to them," he said. Another woman, probably in her 60s, approached with a paper grocery bag. "I brought this for you," she said. "Just a thank you." "They've bullied us for years." Inside the bag were homemade oatmeal cookies and a jar of peach preserves. I didn't say much, just nodded and thanked her. Back at the ridge, I walked up to where the house had stood. The rubble had been cleared by a crew of volunteers and a few old friends. All that remained was a flat patch of earth with tire impressions faded into the soil. I planted a red maple there that spring. Not as a monument, not as a warning, just as something real, something rooted. And this time I put up a sign: private property. Trespassers will be shown the deed. 3 weeks after the court ruling, I got a visit from an investigator with the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. His name was Marcus Denton, mid-40s, lean build, sharp jawline, and a notepad that never left his hand. He wore plain clothes, but the badge on his belt made it clear he wasn't here to chat about wildflowers. "Mr. Kray," he said, stepping onto my porch. "Mind if I ask you a few questions about Silver Pines?" "You're welcome to," I said, shifting my weight so he could see the 12-gauge leaning against the porch rail, just a habit from my days working in remote zones. Never pointed at anyone, but enough to set the tone. He nodded once, like he was used to setting foot on land owned by people who didn't care much for bureaucrats. "I'm part of a task force looking into fraudulent filings across the western counties," he said. "Your case opened a few doors." Turns out Silver Pines has a longer paper trail than we expected. I motioned to the 2 chairs by the railing. He sat, opened his notepad, and began flipping through pages filled with tight handwriting. "Here's what we know," he said. Over the last 6 years, the HOA submitted nearly 24 permits, and easement claims that conflict with county zoning records. Most were small bike paths, drainage diversions, fences that crept a few feet over boundary lines, but yours was the first full structure built entirely on private land without any verifiable ownership. "That sounds less like negligence and more like a business model," I said, watching a hawk circle overhead. Denton didn't smile. "There's more. The board's former treasurer Mark Delaney has been linked to a shell company registered in Wyoming. That company received over $80,000 in consulting fees from Silver Pines over the last year. No invoices, no service descriptions. Just transfers. Let me guess, HOA dues went up during that time by 15%. Residents were told it was for wildfire mitigation." I let out a low breath and leaned back in the chair. "So what happens now?" "We're coordinating with the district attorney," Denton said. "Linda Sharp is already facing charges for forgery and fraud. If we can tie these financial transactions to her and the remaining board members, we're looking at racketeering." He stood and reached into his coat, pulling out a sealed envelope. "This is a formal request for access to any documents or recordings you have concerning the HOA's communications about your property. Emails, printed notices, meeting invites, anything that shows intent. You'll have it by tomorrow," I said. "I keep hard copies of everything." As he left, I caught a glimpse of a black SUV parked farther down the road, engine idling. Another agent, maybe, or someone watching Denton. Either way, things were escalating. That evening, I drove down to the local diner to meet Carla. She had her laptop open, surrounded by folders and a half-eaten tuna melt. "I just got off a conference call with the state bar," she said, skipping pleasantries. "The HOA's attorney Paul Granger has been suspended. Turns out he filed multiple legal documents without properly verifying them, including that forged quitclaim deed, disbarment, pending. But it gets better. I filed a civil racketeering claim on your behalf. If this gets certified, we can go after damages triple the amount." Triple of what? Of the total fraud. Construction costs, legal expenses, land remediation, everything. That includes the costs they passed down to the residents under false pretenses. I raised an eyebrow. So people who paid higher dues might get reimbursed if we win, yes, and public pressure's mounting. Local news ran a segment last night. 3 more residents filed complaints this morning. I nodded slowly. "They're finally waking up. They're angry," she said. "Turns out a lot of them were threatened with fines or liens for asking too many questions." One guy Vietnam vet named Roy had his fence torn down because it was an inch too high. HOA claimed it blocked the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood. Sounds like Linda's rulebook. Oh, it was her all right. The board approved it unanimously without a community vote. 2 days later, another subpoena was issued, this time to Silver Pines banking institution. The forensic audit uncovered unauthorized withdrawals totaling over $230,000. Some of it had been laundered through community improvement grants that never materialized. Others were labeled as contractor prepayments to non-existent companies. Then came the burner phones. A technician hired by the DA's office pulled metadata from an iCloud backup, tied to a number Linda had used. Dozens of messages were recovered, some between her and Delaney, others with an unknown contact listed only as RP. The texts included phrases like "move forward regardless," "he'll fold if we apply pressure," and "land value too good to pass up." The DA's office issued a second arrest warrant, this time for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Delaney was still missing, but the feds were involved now. Border alerts were active, and a quiet bulletin went out to financial institutions nationwide. Meanwhile, Silver Pines HOA collapsed. Without leadership, the remaining board members resigned en masse. Residents held an emergency meeting, one that Carla and I were invited to attend. It was held in a local community center just off the county highway. Folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, and about 50 homeowners filled the hall. Some looked worn down by years of passive compliance. Others were just now realizing how deeply they'd been manipulated. A man in his 60s stood at the front, tall, broad-shouldered, wore a carpenter's apron with a tape measure clipped to the side. "My name's Frank Verla," he said. "I've lived in Silver Pines for 14 years. I built my own house from the ground up. I never wanted any part of the board, but now I think it's time we take it back." There was scattered applause. A woman in the back raised her hand. "What about the lawsuits? What about the money that's gone?" Carla stood. "Some of it may be recovered through restitution. My client, Mr. Kray, is pursuing civil damages, but we've specifically asked the court to prioritize reimbursement for residents who were defrauded." A few heads turned toward me. I stood slowly. "I don't want your land. I don't want your homes. I want what's right. And if you want to rebuild your community without being bullied, I'll help. I've got experience with bylaws, zoning law, and structural compliance. Let's write a charter that protects homeowners, not punishes them." The vote to dissolve the current HOA charter passed unanimously. A volunteer committee was formed that night. Back on my ridge, I installed 2 new motion-activated trail cameras and a solar spotlight. Not because I expected more trespassers, but because I wanted to be sure. Trust, once broken, doesn't come back easy. The red maple I planted had taken root nicely. I staked a support beam beside it to guard against the wind. A few days later, someone left a small wooden sign beside it, hand-carved with a single word: justice. I didn't know who made it. I didn't ask. The DA announced formal charges against 4 former board members the following month. Linda pled guilty to a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. She named names. Delaney was eventually found in Nevada using a fake identity and living out of a rented storage unit. Carla's civil suit proceeded without hitch. The judge certified the racketeering claim, and within 6 months a settlement was reached. I didn't take a dime for myself. My share went into a legal fund for Silver Pines homeowners filing claims of their own. The media moved on. Stories faded, but something had shifted in town. People stopped lowering their voices when they talked about their neighborhoods. They started asking questions, reading their bylaws, showing up to meetings. And on my land, the wind blew clean again. A late autumn chill rolled across the ridge as I walked the survey lines again, GPS tracker in hand, triple-checking every boundary post. That land was marked tighter than a military perimeter now. I didn't trust assumptions, not after what Silver Pines tried. Not after how close they came to stealing something I worked a lifetime to own. The settlement money for the residents had started trickling in. Carla kept me updated. Some homeowners were using it to repaint, repair, or finally install that fence they'd been threatened over. But others, quiet ones, had different stories. They came up my drive one at a time, like ghosts carrying secrets they hadn't dared speak aloud during Linda's reign. First was a young couple, the Hardings. She was a nurse. He worked maintenance at the ski resort. They brought a folder with scanned HOA letters dating back 3 years, accusations of non-compliance, threats to seize their home over a non-existent landscaping violation. The letters were signed by a name I hadn't seen before, Richard Phelps. I remembered the initials. RP. From the burner phone messages recovered by the DA's team, I called Reuben. He showed up that afternoon in a battered Ford with a cracked windshield and a thermos full of something that smelled like gasoline and tasted worse. "You ever hear of Richard Phelps?" I handed him the folder. Reuben flipped through it slowly. "Nope, but I can find him." 2 days later I got a call. "Saul, you sitting down?" "I'm standing in a trench." "Well, get out of it. You're gonna want both feet planted." Phelps wasn't just a rogue board member. He wasn't on any paperwork, didn't appear in any HOA filings, and never showed up to community meetings. But he had a P.O. box registered to a real estate trust that on paper acquired 7 properties in foreclosure over the past 2 years. All Silver Pines homes. And every one of those foreclosures had the same notary stamp on the lien filings, Linda Sharp's. I got a chill colder than the wind cutting through my jacket. They hadn't just tried to steal my land. They'd been running a quiet real estate grab, using the HOA as a legal shell to push homeowners into default, then snapping up the homes for pennies through a trust no one could trace. Carla took the findings straight to the state attorney general's office. Within a week, subpoenas went out. Another search warrant hit the remains of the HOA's office, now abandoned, but still under lease. The agents recovered hard drives, locked filing cabinets, and a backup server someone had tried to destroy using a hammer. Sloppy. They missed the second backup drive hidden behind the filing cabinet, which still held years of internal emails and financial records. The investigation ballooned. Turns out, Linda's husband, who everyone thought was a retired accountant, had been the one filing the lien threats. He'd never been on the board, but he'd signed hundreds of notices under a false title, HOA compliance officer. That position didn't exist in any official capacity. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. At least 4 families had been forced out under fabricated violations. One elderly woman had lost her home after being fined weekly for unauthorized exterior lighting. The lights in question were solar garden stakes sold at the local hardware store. Another family had their mortgage payments redirected after being told the HOA would manage escrow. The money vanished. Their home went into foreclosure 2 months later, the trust that acquired these properties. It was registered under Richard Phelps, but the address linked back to a shell LLC in Nevada, same as Delaney's payout company. The AG's office called it what it was: Organized property theft under color of law, Linda's plea deal evaporated faster than spit on a griddle. She'd lied about the extent of her involvement, and the DA yanked the deal before sentencing. Her new charges included conspiracy to commit wire fraud, coercion, elder abuse, and racketeering. Her husband was arrested the same day, still wearing pajama pants when they brought him out. Delaney was extradited from Nevada and charged separately. He tried to flip on Phelps, but Phelps had already been indicted on federal charges. The feds stepped in once they confirmed that some of the stolen money had been laundered through interstate transfers and out-of-state shell companies. The entire scheme unraveled like rotten rope. I was called to testify again, this time before a grand jury. Carla prepped me in her office, which now had a framed photo of the red maple I'd planted. I hadn't mentioned sending it to her. She just looked at it once while reviewing my testimony and said, "That tree's going to outlive all of them." When I took the stand, I didn't talk about revenge. I talked about boundaries, the kind that matter. Property lines, sure, but also the invisible ones. The lines people cross when they think no one's watching. When they believe authority gives them the right to take, to threaten, to destroy. The jury returned a full slate of indictments. The judge ordered asset seizures. The trust was dismantled, the properties returned to their rightful owners where possible. Others were sold to pay restitution. Silver Pines was dissolved by court order. The charter revoked. The land it sat on was reclassified, stripped of HOA oversight permanently. But the community didn't disappear. Frank Verla and a group of volunteers formed a neighborhood council, not a board, not a governing body, just a rotating group of residents who met monthly to talk, share updates, and handle disputes like adults. No fines, no threats, just neighbors. They invited me to speak at their first community gathering, not as a guest, but as someone who lit the match. It was held in the open field where the HOA's office used to stand. Someone had cleared the debris and planted wildflowers. A makeshift podium stood at the center, flanked by folding chairs and paper lanterns strung between fence posts. Kids ran barefoot through the grass, and the air smelled like barbecue and pine. Frank introduced me with a single sentence. "This is the man who reminded us the land doesn't belong to the loudest voice, it belongs to the one willing to stand and protect it." I didn't have a speech, just a thought. "I worked my whole life for my land," I said. But what it taught me, and what this whole mess proved, is that sometimes land isn't the only thing worth defending. Sometimes it's your name, your neighbor, your peace. They applauded, but I didn't stay long. Crowds still make me uneasy. Back home, I walked the ridge as the sun dipped behind the peaks. The red maple had grown another foot. Its leaves were turning the kind of red you only see in high country autumns, deep, defiant, alive. Reuben stopped by that evening, dragging a cooler and a stack of folding chairs. "You hear about Phelps?" he asked, handing me a bottle. I shook my head. "Turned state's evidence. Might shave a decade off his sentence if he gives up the last of the shell companies." I nodded. "Let him rot a little first." He raised his bottle. "To lines well drawn," I clinked mine against his, "and fences well defended." That night I slept with the windows open, no security lights, no cameras buzzing, just the sound of wind through the pine and a single maple leaf brushing the porch rail. Justice had taken root. And this time, no one was tearing it down.